I switched once again to so-called high-intensity training.
Natural athlete.
So, the main reason why I started this blog has much to do with the change in my training routine during quarantine this year, because I did not have the access to big weights, and I suppose many of us didn't have that access. And I started systematically reaching failure in my sets during my workouts. And what I started to observe was the increase in muscle mass, muscle thickness, and what is more important, in my strength potential. And so there was a simple question in my head: what happens during failure, and why is it such a big precursor for growth? During my 7 years of training, I mainly used conventional and traditional training routine, which consists of a decent amount of sets done in one workout. But the thing is that there were two periods when I tried so-called high-intensity training, and those were interesting experiments, and it was a quite notable experience, but this is the topic for another video. And during all my 7 years of training, I wanted to understand the science behind muscle growth, understand the thermodynamics of human body, biomechanics, biochemistry of the muscle fiber, and so on. And my background in physics and statistics allows me to do so. And that is why I started digging answer for that question: what happens during the failure? And now I want to share my systematized and I would say up-to-date understanding of the process with you, my dear fellows. So, this year during quarantine, I switched once again to so-called high-intensity training routine. And the thing is that we have to understand that when it comes to discussing high intensity and failure, there are at least three different interpretations of high intensity training routine. And the first man to mention the importance of failure and the muscle training process was Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones was famous for the invention of Nautilus machines, but he was also a very successful entrepreneur, an extraordinary personality, and he was also a fierce scholar of muscle growth process, for he was interested in biophysical aspect of the process, and therefore his interest led him to creating those above mentioned Nautilus machines.
Proper style of performance is knowledge. Given exactly the same equipment, some subjects will produce very good results while others produce poor results, or at least that's what happens in an unsupervised situation. So, in the end, it comes down to a matter of proper supervision, or a lack of it. But in the real world, it's almost impossible to properly supervise the training of even a small number of subjects. The usual result being that most trainees are left up to their own devices, with little or nothing in the way of results in return for their efforts.
So Arthur Jones offered a few alterations to training process, and to be exact, failure as the main factor of growth. For when we are reaching the failure, we are doing the most intense work, and intensity is the key. Forced reps and negatives are very important. What is more, slow movement with a clear emphasis on a negative, or another way to call it, eccentric part of the movement. More than one set to failure may lead to deterioration of the progress. It means that we shouldn't do more than one set to failure for one body part. And what is more, increased compared to conventional volume routine rest between training sessions up to 3 days. And the rep range was in between of 8 and 12 reps. What is more, Arthur Jones proposed to do full body workouts.
Jones's recommendations were mainly derived on scientific and empirical studies, and he was very interested in the physical measures of the process. And the latter led to the creation of the Nautilus machines that exploit strength curve effect. Many famous athletes later worked with Arthur Jones. Among them, I would say the most notable athlete was Mike Mensah and his brother Ray Mensah. At some point of time, Sergio Oliva cooperated with Arthur Jones, and what is more, he worked with Casey Vieta on his famous Colorado experiment, and Boyarko, and many other athletes. Что-то я косячу. Later, high-intensity approach was adopted by Mike Mensah, one of the most notable athletes of late 70s and early 80s. And Mike, I would say, was certainly an independent thinker, but he inclined very much towards the philosophy, and therefore he did the job of mastering the logic behind the Arthur Jones routine. And the thing is that he did not worry that much about the empirical part of the process, as he was very concerned with the theoretical beauty of this training scheme. And this led to the creation of his heavy-duty training routine. Mike says that training can be considered similar to the medical intervention in the body as it alters metabolic processes. And as our medical treatment is strictly theoretized and measured, then our training sessions should also be theoretized and strictly rationed. He followed the line of thought offered by Canadian physiologist Cellier, who said that stress can both lead and not lead to the adaptation. For example, if the stress is too high, then there are no resources left in the body to create the adaptation, and if the stress is too low, there is no sense for the body to adapt, because the body is already ready to, deal with that stress. And so, Mike said that the amount of work done in the gym should be substantial enough to launch the muscle growth process.
Bear in mind that your actual, literal purpose as a bodybuilder is to go to the gym and intelligently, rationally, logically, knowingly do what nature requires merely to activate the growth mechanism, then get the hell out, go home, rest and grow.
Here I mentioned some particular traits of heavy-duty routine developed by Mike. First of all, based on individual's properties, rest between training sessions for one muscle group can be extended up to more than 14 days. And by the way, this is perfectly compliant with the fact that it takes myofibrillar 10 or 21 days to recover with supercompensation from one training session. What is more, extremely reduced amount of work for one muscle group. One training session in 3 or 5 days on average, and during one training session approximately 7 sets to failure. Forced reps and negatives are also highly recommended here. Rest pause techniques is implemented. The rep range is between 6 and 9 reps, and what is more, Mike made a very clear emphasis as the further we progress, then we should train with higher intensity level, and at the same time we should rest more and we should do less volume. So as you progress, you should do more intense work with less volume and more rest.
Mike surely did an overwhelming job, but his approach was mainly philosophical and logical, and therefore he ignored some empirical aspects of the process. For example, he completely ignores the effect of different muscle fibers when it comes to creating a proper training routine. But what he surely did was finding the right vector when it comes to training naturally without use of steroids, which means reaching failure.
So, as I have already told you, Mike did an overwhelming job, and he was extremely successful at pinning down one of the most important factors. And to be precise, he forced the rest to be approximately of 14 days for one muscle group, and this is the exact time, it averages from 10 to 21 days, but still 14 days is the most cited average for the myofibrillar to recover with supercompensation. But at the same time, he completely ignores the fact that the rate of muscle protein synthesis is elevated for approximately 3 days after the training session in the muscle group. And in this sense, Arthur Jones' heavy-duty principles are somewhat superior because they stimulate the high rate of muscle protein synthesis throughout the whole time of training.
Later, the most famous advocate of high-intensity training, Dorian Yates, proved that you can be the best in the sport of bodybuilding using high-intensity approach regardless of federation policies. He also somewhat altered the training principles offered by Jones and Mensah to make them suitable for the 90s era. But what he does, he basically neglects volume, he emphasizes the role of failure and intensity, he emphasizes the importance of rest, he does something in between of 6 to 8 reps for the upper body and something in between of 8 to 12 reps for the legs.
I wonder, because Arthur Jones's personality seems like your personality a little bit. I don't know if it is or not. I could be wrong.
I don't know too much about personality, but I read all his books and it just resonated with me. Like, this is logic, man. This makes sense.
Right.
First of all, it makes sense. Second, let me do it in practice and see what happens. So it could make great sense, but if I do it and it doesn't work, then what's it worth? It's worth nothing, right? So I tried it and I experimented and I have kept logs. I've got every single workout that I ever did from 1983 to 1997 written down.
Well, that was a very brief history of high-intensity training. If you are interested about it, I highly recommend reading Arthur Jones, Mike Mensah, and watching interviews with Dorian Yates. But for me, the most confusing part is that all up-to-date and modern scientific articles coincide in the fact that volume is a very important factor of muscle growth. At the same time, there are those successful examples of using high intensity, and I myself train both high volume and high intensity. And for me, I find that high intensity is way more efficient. So here is a contradiction. All the high intensity training routines, they neglect volume. At the same time, empirical studies show that volume is of importance. And so, whom to believe? So, as for references and materials, you can find them attached below in the description of the video. In the following videos, I will try to solve the mystery of volume and intensity dilemma and make some explanation using biochemistry. So, stay tuned.